I think statistically we actually process about 11 million bits of information subconsciously, but consciously we are only paying attention to about 50 to 60 bits of information. So what our brain does is it will make shortcuts based off of our previous experiences to influence our decision making for quicker and more effective decisions. Biases are a double-edged sword. It could work to your it could work to your benefit, but it could also be detrimental.
But what matters is the awareness.
Yes, the awareness of it, and just also including other people in decision making.
If you're the smartest in the room, or you think you're the smartest in the room, then you're probably not in the right room. You need to be in rooms where your opinions are challenged, that you're not the absolute truth and nothing but the truth, and of course moments where you need to have extreme conviction, because that is also what separates the wheat from the chaff. Hello everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the After Hours in partnership with Tanqueray. Happy International Women's Month. I am very, very excited to be having women only this month for the Tanqueray After Hours segment. Today, of course, you can already tell, and if you can't tell, then you've not been tuning into the episodes enough. We are at the Art Cafe Gastro Bar that have served us these amazing drinks, Tanqueray branded. Today's a special day because we're trying something different in terms of the format of the show that we're going to be having. As you know, it's International Women's Month. So what does it really mean for you to be unmistakably her?
Good question. First of all, yay to women. For me, being unmistakably her means pushing the confines and the boundaries that have been set for me as a woman, and being able to embrace myself holistically. And for example, traits that are considered masculine, embracing them, walking into a room unapologetically and speaking your mind. This is what I want, this is what I need. Those are traits that have traditionally been paired with men, but I think for me, it's being able to embrace my entirety, both my feminine traits and my masculine traits. And I think that's what makes a human regardless of gender. So as a clinical psychologist, for me, it means even as I continue on with my career, being able to see people, and women especially, beyond the lens of what they've been expected or conditioned to be. And normally we'll find that if you compare just society, men and women kind of tend to fall into their roles and stick with their roles so much so that even if you tell them to step outside of it, it's almost like it's a scary thing for them to do. So for me, as a psychologist, it's just empowering people and encouraging people to be able to explore more than just what society tells them they should be.
As we get into that, Nimara, I want us to just tell our audience what wonderful drinks we are having, courtesy of Tanqueray and Art Cafe Gastro Bar. What are you having?
Well, today I'm having a gin and tonic. It's plain and simple, but good.
Classic. It's a classic. And I am having a gin cooler, also a classic, and nobody does it better than Tanqueray and Art Cafe Gastro Bar. So if you're here, make sure that you check out their drinks menu and make sure it's Tanqueray branded, because it could be biased, but those are the best drinks in the menu, okay? This is the 6th episode, and look, I've tried many a cocktail here, and I think you are in for an amazing time if you take the time to come and order a Tanqueray-based cocktail. Today is an interesting show. We are going to be getting into cognitive biases now. You might be wondering what those are and how that comes into play when it comes to Tanqueray Africa. Well, in the quest of growing your business, your startup, or even being an ecosystem player, one of the things that you need to also think about is how to be the road to becoming successful. How do you lead your teams? How do you grow your business? How do you make decisions that have a psychological analysis in the background? And so I decided it's about time we had a clinical psychologist to really get into the roots of how to become successful with the capacity of having your mental health and capabilities at its peak. So yeah, Nimara, I've given a brief overview, but you can introduce yourself to our audience.
That is a really good brief overview. So my name is Nimara Newa. I'm a clinical psychologist by practice, and I'm also currently pursuing my master's in clinical psychology, just about to finish. Other than that, I'm also just a creative at heart. I'm a writer as well. I'm also a musician for myself, not for the public. I play the
Why?
piano.
I am also part of the public. Like, why are you not playing? Musician.
I used to
tendencies.
play, but now it's very behind the scenes. I'm currently focusing more on my writing and my career path in psychology. So it's really a blessing to be here with you to talk about psychological aspects in the tech ecosystem, which is very, tech.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah, and 100%. I think this is a necessary conversation. I think tech is very fast paced, especially if you're coming from the startup background, and there's a lot of things that get left into translation. Of course, biasly. Ironically, biasly, I tend to think in the process of building, people usually forget the marketing aspects of it because you're so focused on the product. But it's not just marketing; it's other things that create a successful business, like the psychological analysis, which I'm very curious for everybody to be informed by this conversation that we're going to have today. So thank you so much for gracing the after hours.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
So before we get into cognitive biases, just to give a quick overview of how you even got to clinical psychology or your interest in clinical psychology, could you give us just a bit of a rundown for that?
From a young age, I always kind of knew I wanted to be in the health industry. It's always kind of been my, I would say, calling. But initially when I was growing up, I started out as wanting to be a nurse because my auntie was a nurse and I just thought it was, really cool. Then once I got into uni, I actually joined med school to do pharmacy. But then quickly on, I realized, I think I'm more interested in working with people than actually being in the lab setting. So then I pivoted after 2 years into psychology and I fell in love with it.
Yes.
And immediately I was done with my undergrad. I continued with my master's on into clinical psychology, still settling in and trying to now discover my actual niche in psychology.
Wow, I love that. Okay. So now getting into cognitive bias, maybe you can start with the beginning. What is a cognitive bias and how does it come into play in this context?
Okay, so cognitive biases. Before we even get into biases, maybe we can talk about cognition in general. What is cognition? And sometimes if you have had the word cognition before, sometimes it's interchangeably used with thinking, but cognition is more than just thinking. For example, if I asked you, what do you think about a specific thing, you would say something different from me. So the underlying, what comes beneath the thought is our perspectives, our prejudices, our fears, and that's what influences our whole cognition. So to summarize it, I would say that cognition is just thinking that is subjective to you as an individual.
Okay, and then where does bias come in our cognition?
So now the bias comes in because normally when we make decisions, our brain really work at a fast-paced rate. And I think statistically, we actually process about 11 million bits of information subconsciously. But consciously, we're only paying attention to about 50 to 60 bits of information. So what our brain does is it will make shortcuts based off of our previous experiences to influence our decision making for quicker and more effective decisions. So our mind is not so much concerned with accuracy, but it's concerned with efficiency. Your mind wants to make work easier for you.
Yeah.
So it will use mental shortcuts, which we call cognitive biases or heuristics, because they can both be beneficial, but they can also be detrimental. It's a double-edged sword.
You've mentioned that a lot of it has to do with effectiveness comparatively to accuracy.
Yeah.
And some would argue that that is exactly what they're looking for, is an efficient system instead of having to be accurate. I tend to believe that I don't believe in absolutes, which is 100% and absolute decisions. And so what would you say to people who probably believe, especially within the tech startup landscape, that efficiency is what they're going for, compared to maybe when they're looking to focus on accuracy more?
I would say that when you're starting out on something, it is important to focus on your gut feeling about things, to lead you to certain directions. But it gets to a point, like for example, when you're building a startup, that you can't just base decisions off of your gut feeling or your intuition. You have to make decisions based off of data that backs up your decision making, especially when it comes to leading like teams, because you're not just leading yourself and making decisions for yourself and for your gut feeling. You have a whole team behind you that your decision making will affect literally every single step of the way. So both are important, but when you start to manage bigger teams, making decisions that are high stake, then you need to balance the rationale and the intuition.
Okay.
Yeah.
Before we get into the types of cognitive biases, or maybe after, you can get into, okay, then what do we need to do in the process when we're trying to push for efficiency before accuracy? What do we need to do to prepare that journey effectively so that we know subconsciously this is what we're working towards, even if this is a startup, this is where we are now, being able to identify that, okay, perhaps in your argument it could be identifying your cognitive biases and running with them as we go. But before we get into that, perhaps a comment on that as well.
I think the first and foremost thing is to be aware, like you said, be aware that we are human beings and we make decisions, and it doesn't mean that when we make bad decisions, we are actually failures or we are not smart. You know, sometimes we make bad decisions because of trusting our gut feeling instead of focusing on the facts. Working from efficiency to accuracy, we need to keep in mind that we need to be aware, first of all, of the fact that we are susceptible to these cognitive biases, and how to sort of make it less on us is to have different perspectives. So when you're building a team, for example, I think we were talking about this previously, how it is important to have a co-founder when, you know, having a startup, because you get to have a different perspective on a particular issue. And sometimes you make decisions and you genuinely think that this is the right decision for your business.
Yes.
But then you have a different perspective that gives you a different view that you hadn't seen.
Yeah.
And so also just being open to the fact that it's never a linear process, and it takes a holistic perspective and integrating and allowing ourselves to ask the question like, okay, so I want to make this decision, but is there anyone around me that actually thinks differently or disagrees with what I'm about to do? And why do they disagree? It doesn't have to fully influence your decision making. You can still go ahead and, you know, move forward with your decision. But I think it's important to accommodate different perspectives before making a decision, especially a high-stake decision in a business or a brand.
I definitely agree. I think being a solo founder for a bit over a year, I tend to have biases myself, and I am also someone who has quite a bit of conviction in the decisions that I do make, and so hiring the team, the few people that I have on the team now, when hearing a different opinion. This morning we were just debating, okay, this thumbnail, if it was just me, I would have gone with the thumbnail we chose for the video that was going up today. But now that I had some of the team members chime in and say, okay, maybe this is a bit too busy, this is that, then I'm able to question that cognition that I have, and not just in the thumbnail context, but in the grand scheme of things. And so smaller scale, but a grand message that you're trying to communicate. And maybe would you like to now tell us about the different types
to add on to what you're saying, you know, sometimes it can look like it's a small scale, but apparently 60% of businesses actually fail because of poor decision making. And the decision making comes from, you know, the leaders and the founders and all those things. And
how they just naturally think in general.
And your belief system, it will influence how you manage your business, how you manage your personnel, you know, how you even market your business. It's influenced by your beliefs. And it's not to say that your beliefs are wrong. It's just the awareness that, I might be biased in this particular area. And there's an example I also came across when doing my research. In 1999, apparently there was a spacecraft that was launched by NASA, and it was supposed to go to Mars, but it actually ended up, you know, disintegrating in space, all because of a small mistake where there was a team that used newtons. I don't even remember the last time we used newtons as a unit, and another team used pounds. But they all just assumed that the metric is the same, and literally ended up calculating different things and not being efficient.
Being able to be efficient and not really checking in their biases.
Yeah, and they ended up losing about $125 million just because of a small mistake that came from maybe overconfidence or just assuming that this is how we calculate things on our team. So that's probably how they do it as well.
I think it's really crucial to have these kind of conversations, especially with the people working within this industry, because a lot of the times the way the ecosystem is structured, the decisions have to be made very quick, especially that move when you finally get your first round of seed funding and it's coming from VC investors. You almost have to switch gears and make really, really quick decisions. I mean, we've interacted together and you've seen my work. Sometimes I kind of have to try and push to move quickly on things, quicker than maybe stereotypically you would do, because that's just the industry I'm in. So you can imagine, I don't know if I'm a good example, but you can imagine me 5 times more. That's essentially sometimes the pace in which these founders and CEOs are expected to make such concrete decisions. And so back to that conversation on the progress between efficiency and accuracy. I think as an individual, as a founder, as an ecosystem player, being able to be, like you said, to recognize the patterns that you have in your cognition and your bias, so that you're able to make decisions in when it comes to the bigger things, because it's not coming from nowhere, it's coming from the decisions that you make now, the foundation of the team that you make now, and how you will to lead them to thinking, so that they can also lead forward more towards the accuracy bit. I want us to get a bit more into the types of cognitive biases. So what are you had mentioned to me previously that you have 5 types of cognitive biases you want to speak on. Let's run us through them.
There are actually very many types of cognitive biases, but for the sake of the discussion, we can just narrow down to 5. And the first one I would like us to talk about is confirmation bias, which basically means you see what you believe. You don't believe what you see. That makes sense. So when you're looking at something, you're not looking at it from the lens of just, oh, this is a new piece of information that I'm now bringing into my mind. Your mind is seeking to connect it with something that is already existing in your consciousness. So you're more likely to look for information that confirms that which you already know, as opposed to looking for information that will counteract what you know. A good example is, if you think I don't like you in your head consciously, and then you text me today morning and I don't respond, what's the likely conclusion that you would make?
I would make the conclusion that you're affirming that you don't like me.
Because I'm not responding to you, and maybe I'm just caught up, and in the tech space you'll see, for example, someone is so into a specific niche, like, I don't know, cryptocurrency. They'll look for trends that confirm that it's successful and ignore like the dangers, maybe market manipulation or like other issues that could come into play in decision making. And also, just to hinge off of confirmation bias, there's something called selective perception, which is what causes confirmation bias. And it basically means you filter out, even as you look for information that confirms what you already know, you end up filtering out information that will confirm your emotional state of the situation, or just make you feel like, oh, this is something that, oh, I've seen before, and I think it's confirming that which I already know. Now, I have like a personal example about this. You do know that I was hacked recently, and after deciphering,
sorry for laughing.
What
has skipped my mind.
My Instagram account was hacked, and after deciphering what happened, it was actually a cause of selective perception. Someone texted me through my cousin's account, and they were, talking about a deal here and there, and I had missed my cousin, and once I just saw in the block of text cousin and money, I completely blocked out everything and ended up interacting with them up to the point where, I lost my account. I ended up getting it back though, which was good. But yeah, it can lead to detrimental situations where you lose out on something because you just but your mind filtered out information that it actually likes and that is familiar.
I want to bring in something into the conversation. Could that also be, on the flip side of the coin, a good thing? Because one of the things that I know we are pushed to do as entrepreneurs, founders, ecosystem players, whatever it may be, is for you to do enough research that you're so sure about what it is that you're saying and the product that you're building, that even if, yes, this could be a bias about what I'm also feeding my mind and everything, however, that is what makes a founder strong, or someone, an investor, want to invest in a company, is that they are so sure and have the data to back that this idea that they have is in fact a solid. And yes, they might not get maybe they might not get the traction from many other investors. However, someone who is audacious enough to believe in such a quirky idea then gets the opportunity. So my question is, could that also be, is that necessarily a bad thing? And how do we combat then this bias if in the cases where it prevents us from other opportunities?
I mean, it is a good thing to research deeply about the area of interest that you do have. I think now when it becomes detrimental is when you focus so much on information, just talking about that which, the advantages, the benefits, the strengths of what you're looking at, but you forget to look at the counteracting information. Like, what if it doesn't work out? Or what are other perspectives that can show there's a weakness in this area? And it's not to say that you don't dig deep into the goods and the benefits of a particular area, but it's just to say that you don't disregard that there could be a different downside to this really good thing that you're trying to build.
Yeah. Very valid. Okay, what about the other bias that we have on the table?
So the other bias we have is called the anchoring bias, and it's also called the first impression effect. And it means that when you get a piece of information, the first part of the information is probably what's going to influence how you process everything else. Let me give an example, then it can probably land better. You're walking along here and you see a signpost with 50% discount, and then you see the price up down there, a small price. You're probably likely to be drawn to the discount, even though the price is probably, the discounted price is probably the market value price.
Yeah.
But because they said there's a discount, your mind will settle on the fact that it's a discount, so it must be beneficial.
You're coming for us communication specialists.
Yes, and you guys use this a lot because of how you frame marketing things. Like if I told you have a 95% of success rate in something, or I told you have a you
have a 5% chance
of not being successful or of dying when doing an operation. Those two pieces of information are relaying the same thing, but just how they are phrased is landing differently in our consciousness.
No, I agree what you're saying. I think I wouldn't say subconsciously. We hadn't put a name into what we do as communications professionals, but our job is to essentially create a not falsified information, but how we tweak the narrative to be able to make the impact or the effect that we wanted to have. Yes. So with that kind of bias, I take it in two ways. It could be negative from the person on the other side, who's coming in to look at, 50% off, or this product is giving free transactions, this fintech, and now I'm more intrigued to work on it. But then now asking yourself deeper questions about what it is that they're actually communicating, instead of falling for the shiny coin syndrome, which I know is something people fall victim for. However, on the other side, I think if you're an ecosystem player or someone who's trying to push whatever narrative that you're trying to express, or whatever product that you're trying to express, then this could be a bias that then I would say use to your advantage. You already know that the people, you as yourself, aside from messaging, and maybe you can give another example after this, but in terms of messaging, if I am able to use this to my advantage and tailor my messaging in accordance to what the majority bias is likely to think, then I see it as an advantage point, to say the least. I mean, of course, I'm in communication. This is my Tanqueray Africa. So.
Gotcha. Yes. But I actually just thought of another example as you were speaking, that it can be an advantage to actually know about this bias. Say, for example, you're in an interview most likely the first person to give the prize, whether it's the employer or the candidate, that's likely the value that the negotiation is going to center around, because it's the first thing that has been put on the table. So you can use it to your advantage by being crazy with, stating your price, because that price will probably be in the conscious of the person you're arguing with.
Yes.
Or negotiating with, for that matter.
When it comes to finances, I think that is something that I don't know if it's just me, but I still try and figure out, okay, what is it that I'm asking for from investors? What is it that my company is worth? What is it that this proposal that I'm sending is going to be worth?
Yeah.
And each time I try to push the needle, I notice that maybe I'm not pushing enough. I think there's a cognitive bias naturally in women when it comes to finances, and I don't know, perhaps this could be a conversation for another day, but I somewhat feel when I communicate with women, or just in my own personal business doing, I probably would ask for something or a quote that is what in my head is like, oh, but maybe this is too much. Will they leave? Will they not? Compared to the bias that a man has, which is, I know everything that I'm telling you. I am worth this price. I will justify this price, and I will die on this hill. And I think the person on the other side of the end also feels that bias and understands that, okay, women could be this and men could be that. I don't know if you have something to say about that, because I think it's a very prevalent thought process in the space.
It is. And I think what I would say about that is just that I think men have more audacity when speaking about that first price, because they're aware that the person who they're telling that first price is going to be stuck on that price, and so whether or not they come in and negotiate, they'll be negotiating from what they've already mentioned, regardless of whether it's too high up or too low up. So for women now, we in our heads we put the price lower because maybe we're too in our heads about what the other person is going to think, and the perspective of the other person before thinking about ourselves, and just saying that this is where I want to start from, and if they want to counter that, they're going to have to start from the highest point possible.
Okay, tell us about the third bias.
So the third bias is called the bandwagon effect, which is very common, and not even just in the tech space, but just in the world in general. And it's just where you jump into a trend because it's popular. You've not really given it that much thought, but you've seen it working for other people, and you decide to just jump on it. It could be beneficial if you're lucky, but sometimes it could also lead to a lot of losses. And I think the first example that comes into mind is when NFTs were booming. Maybe they still are, you can tell me, or like the metaverse, and everyone
we're holding the NFTs. Actually, we know what we're doing. 10 years time. I myself invested in NFTs, so 30 years in Maldives.
I hope I'm there to see it. But it could be beneficial, but sometimes you just find yourself jumping on a wave because it's trendy, not because you've actually done your research on the market, on the space, to realize that this is good for me. And to stretch it even further is when you have a business that you're now, jumping on the wave with, there's a lot more, at stake when it's not just a decision for yourself.
What I have to say to that, I think another bias that I would say has two sides of the coin. Right? When I was having a conversation with Dominic and Evans, who right now have the admin access, check it out on Tanqueray Africa or the other channels that they have. But Evans is would call it the Chinese way of doing business. Or Tony Ndungu, I think, also talked about this on TikTok recently. But what that means is the Chinese have somewhat built a reputation and a successful economic, geopolitical career. Is it called a career? But geopolitical standing, because they've capitalized in coping models that work already. And in the African context, I would relate it to the fintech industry. I think because we've not yet found a solution like Stripe in the global perspective that can have a solution that has a mass impact across the continent because of many reasons. Africa is fragmented, etc. A lot of people still lean towards fintech because one, that's where a lot of investors are going, and
Yeah.
quite frankly, I think that's where how a lot of people make
Yeah.
decisions. Not trying to go the route where there's little traction, but then try and make my space. If I can try and be part of this, what's going on here, and hopefully find my place there, then would it necessarily be a bad thing? And also in this case, is this necessarily a bad thing?
No,
or
like
is
I
it
said
okay?
at the beginning, biases are a double-edged sword. It could work
did
to
say
your
that.
it could work to your benefit, but it could also be detrimental.
But what matters is the awareness.
Yes, the awareness of it, and just also including other people in decision making, so that if you are biased, for example, and many people do agree with that bias, that
you
is
can
still
go
your
and
team.
do it.
You can go ahead and do it, but just being aware of the fact that if it does go wrong, it was a bias, and maybe now seeing ways to deal with
To
that.
deal with that.
Yeah.
Okay, very valid, guys. You can let us know in the comments so far what you think about these biases and how you see them as an advantage or a disadvantage,
Yeah.
depending on what context we're speaking on. Walk us through the fourth bias that we have.
The fourth bias that we have is called the sunk cost fallacy, and it's actually very, very common in businesses where, because you have started investing in something, even as it continues to fail and you're seeing it's failing, you say, I've invested so much money and resources in this, we can't stop now. We just have to keep going with this product, with this app, with this, whatever it is that you're building. And even in day-to-day life situations, a common example that I think of is if you're in a relationship, just a relationship, you can see it's going well. It's kind of toxic, but you say, I've been with this person for 5 years. If I leave now, I'm leaving all this, time and effort and dedication and commitment that I've put into it. But you need to ask yourself, if I could start this business again, if I could start building this product again, would I invest in it? You've invested this far, but you could end up losing much more in the end if you don't stop and ask yourself, am I actually investing in something that has actually failed? Or can this actually continue to become something good?
Yeah, no, I really like that point as well. I think this is the most common
Yeah.
kind of bias that in the landscape we tend to go through, and even just ourselves, especially as entrepreneurs. You fall in love in the process with your product, and once again, I'm gonna go ahead and bring Evans into the equation because he was one of our first guests on Tanqueray Africa, and I remember vividly in his episode saying, "Don't fall too in love with your product." Because
That
the
is
product
bias.
you begin with is less likely to be the end outcome of what the product is going to be. And so what a lot of people tend to do is, this is the idea, it's grand, you have investment for it, this is how I'm gonna change and make an impact. However, in the process, if you hold on to what that is, perhaps the core values can remain the same, perhaps the idea or the industry could be the same. However, if it's, I tend to have a threshold, and you know this, I tend to have a longer threshold of tolerance for pain or suffering, because for me it's like that hard work is supposed to eventually pay off, and I think, a lot of you in the audience probably think the same way that I do, and you can let us know in the comments. And so you're almost denying that inevitability of a heartbreak by keeping pursuing this path, because where am I going to start? What do you mean that this is not working out? It has to work out. I didn't have a plan B. Even if I have a plan B, like I now have this money, I'm burning through money. I don't know what to do next. But so how would you advise someone to identify this as a bias that they have in the process of them doing what they're doing? And I guess the advice of what to do next once you've identified that maybe this for real is not working out regardless of the situation.
I think one important thing that is also linking to a bias we've talked about earlier, but it's to start by getting feedback. I like the idea of, I'm currently doing my research, and we're always advised to have a small pilot study before you actually go to do the research itself, to kind of just get feedback about your product. And sometimes when you're so in love with your product, you'll have other biases building up. You get one piece of feedback and then you anchoring bias, like we talked about, you anchor yourself onto that one feedback and you ignore other pieces of feedback that are coming in about your product, and then you stick to one perspective and you try to enhance it based off of this one perspective, and then it starts to fail and you're like, but they told me this. But it's just that expanding
Absolutely.
your awareness and consciousness about different perspectives regarding your business, and being open to the fact that I could be wrong, you know. I could have a weakness here and it's not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing to know about the weaknesses early on to be able to prevent them from becoming detrimental.
Affecting you in the future.
Yeah.
Okay. Tell us about the fifth cognitive bias.
Okay, so the fifth and final cognitive bias is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. It was named after
We learned this in uni.
it was named after the psychologist who actually, came up with it. It's a funny story. But it's also called the overconfidence bias. And it's where someone who has just started learning about something, or to come into the tech world, someone who's maybe gone to Moringa, or they've done a boot camp in coding, or they've just won a hackathon competition, they now think they are the guru in the field, and they're more likely to put themselves in places where they feel like they can handle big teams and big projects, whereas someone who is a seasoned leader or has experienced the space more is actually hesitant to take on this big project because they understand the underlying complexity with this. And it happens because when you're learning something new, there's normally like a bell curve where when you're just getting into it, you're excited to learn something new, and then you learn the basic concepts and you're like, oh, this is something I can, get on board with. But you continue to learn and you see that it's actually getting complex as you go. And that's why people who have learned something up to a certain level of complexity, they understand so much that this thing is bigger than just the basic concepts, and they're able to step back and say, oh, I don't think I have what it takes to do this. This needs more time. This needs more people on board. This needs a different, perspective or a different approach, so to speak. Yeah. And then eventually, I was doing the curve. Eventually, after you've passed that hard stage of learning, you now get into the expert level where you now know the basic concepts, you know how hard it is and how complex it is, but you've spent enough time learning that now it's settled into your system.
So in this cycle, where do people mostly fall off? Or I'd like you to give a more holistic example about in the business or corporate or startup context, how that could come into play
and affect. It could come into play maybe and now a lot of Gen Zs are coming into the market with their personality and their full force. So you get someone who's just come into the space and now they've been asked to lead a team. It could come into play when they're issuing, delegating roles and even setting something as small as a time frame to complete a certain project. They might assume that it will take a shorter time, or they can quickly code this thing or quickly finish doing it and give deadlines that are unrealistic because they're not aware of the complexity that it involves to build something that is efficient. So it can come into play with such decisions when someone who's just started out in the industry has not understood the whole scope of what it takes to actually build a good product.
I look at this, out of all the biases, I will biasly say that could be my favorite kind of bias, because just I believe in the power of conviction and believing in what you're doing and the purpose that you're living. And I believe that this bias is good and bad at the same time, and it's very distinct. It's a good bias for you to have if, yes, this is a new space, this is a new company, I am gonna make that mark. I don't know, but there's that willingness. Of course, there has to be that willingness to understand that I may not know, but yes, I can build a team because it's something that I did myself. I got into fintech 3.5 years ago. I got my first job when I was still in uni, where I had a bit of background experience, but 3 years down the line, I was able to build an efficient marketing team. We were able to get acquisition. We were able to discover more, market the different products, offerings that we had. But that is something that maybe if on the other side, which I think is a negative and people should push against, not believing enough of yourself to prevent you from actually getting to the next step that you need to. So maybe what's good is like a balance or understanding you yourself. Where do you fall in this spectrum? You can be an introvert but never about your success, and most of the times the people who make the most noise, they're the people who end up in power, because you're able to articulate very efficiently what you're doing, even if it's all dust. Maybe they might go fast but not far, but they're still gonna get somewhere.
And that's actually one of the detriments of, being so excited about just learning a new concept that you don't challenge yourself to get to expert level.
You have to follow through.
You've seen results, this is exciting, it's actually working with the little that you know.
Yeah.
So you don't challenge yourself to get to
I
the
see this a lot in
expert.
salespeople. I mean, that is their job. They start the relationship and then from there someone else good riddance. But salespeople have this bias a lot. Like, I just need to secure this client. How the journey goes after the client is secured is not up to me. But once they're in, and so I guess you guys can take that to fit whatever context that we're speaking on. And I think one of the last questions that I have for you as we wrap up this episode is, how then, as a clinical psychologist and what we've discussed in cognitive biases, how would you say a clinical psychologist's impact in this context would be necessary? Should there be more psychologists when it comes to business and analysis? Is that something that, in your experience or research, that you're seeing a lot of people are implementing or not? Or what is your opinion when it comes to tying in what we're talking about, clinical psychology in general, and when it comes to business in the grand scheme of things?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, there's space for us in almost all industries, but I think we're important in especially the tech industry, where it's very fast paced. People don't have time to sit down and think about, oh my gosh, am I actually being aware? You need to make quick decisions. You need to move fast. So having someone to sit you guys down and remind you, oh, actually, how aware are you about this thing that you're doing? Or bring different departments together to exchange perspectives and to see, okay, our department has settled on this, but does the whole team agree with what we are doing? And then even having things like trainings or strategies to enhance teams, so that the more you make decisions, you're making decisions from a holistic perspective, not just like, oh, the founder has said, so it must be done. And something that I really like that can be implemented in teams is having like a devil's advocate in some meetings, where you have a meeting and you intentionally decide that you're going to have maybe 2 or 3 people who are just going to counteract your point of views, and just give feedback that negates what you originally think. And of course, it has to have a safe space environment so that people don't argue and beef, which is where we come in. And we can, create an environment where people can give different perspectives, and you can pick one that works for everyone, and not just one that is influenced by the bias of the founder or, the leader of the team. Yeah.
I think that is a powerful way to end this episode. For my part, in short, I will say, look, if you're the smartest in the room, or you think you're the smartest in the room, then you're probably not in the right room. You need to be in rooms where your opinions are challenged, that you're not the absolute truth and nothing but the truth, and of course moments where you need to have extreme conviction, because that is also what separates the wheat from the chaff. Elon Musk or President Trump, as much as it's a terrible example, depends on who's listening. You almost have to be somewhat insane for you to be able, and very, very, very sure about what you're doing to get to those places. But in the process, don't forget to check on your biases, check on your teams, and understand that this is we always say ecosystem, and so this is not just a solo journey. This is something that everybody needs to be involved for you to be able to move from what we're talking about, to be able to move from what to accuracy.
Oh, efficiency.
To be able to move
to
from
accuracy.
efficiency to to accuracy.
And just to add on that, it's not that making bias, smart people don't make wrong decisions. They do, but it's not that I'm dumb. It's just that I have a bias in this particular area, and to know that it's not that we can get to a level where we don't completely have biases, but just finding a way to be able to lessen the detrimental effects that come from making decisions based off of biases. But having biases doesn't make us, dumb or stupid. It just makes us human. Yeah.
Cheers to that. Cheers to recognizing our biases.
Yeah.
All right, guys, this has been an absolutely amazing conversation. I personally enjoyed it. It's making me reflect, okay, what is it that I need to go back to the drawing board and from the 5 biases that you've given, to better improve myself in the process as I get into this venture of entrepreneurship. And I want to thank you for once again for joining and sharing this narrative, and I hope it makes an impact in the people who are listening right now.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you for creating spaces for people like me in this fast-paced world, for someone who's used to the slowness of psychology.
Yes.
So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, guys. We've come to the end of the episode. Just a reminder that you should be drinking Tanqueray or nothing this month. Happy Women's Month once again, and my name is Alice Kanjejo, your lovely host, and I shall see you in the next one. Bye.